All right, let's dive right in. Today we're looking at a paper called The Glass House of Europe, and it makes a pretty explosive argument that a hidden empire is secretly shaping the entire global response to the climate crisis. It really flips the script on one of the most basic stories we think we know about the modern world. So, the whole analysis kicks off with this one really provocative question. We're all taught that the age of European empire is a thing of the past, right? But this paper argues that that idea isn't just wrong, it's dangerously misleading. You know the story we all get in history class? After World War II, there was this huge wave of decolonization, and the old European empires just dissolved. Everything got wrapped up in a neat and tidy bow. But this is where the paper we're exploring today throws a wrench in the works. It basically frames that entire story as a myth, arguing that decolonization, well, it never actually finished. In fact, the authors use these exact words. They call that standard historical narrative substantially false. Their argument is that empire didn't really end. It just changed its clothes, put on a disguise to make it much harder to see. So, how can they make such a bold claim? Well, the numbers alone are pretty staggering. Right now, today, over 6.4 million people are still living in territories that are directly controlled by European powers. And listen, these aren't just a few tiny, isolated islands. We're talking about roughly 30 inhabited territories scattered across every single ocean on the planet. This isn't some historical footnote. For millions of people, it is a living, breathing reality. And this control has enormous consequences. Just take France's exclusive economic zone. That's the chunk of the ocean it controls. It adds up to 11 million square kilometers. That makes it the second largest in the entire world. This one number just brilliantly illustrates the massive scale of this hidden power. The paper actually calls this a hidden blue empire. So let's kind of pull out a map, so to speak, and see what this thing actually looks like and why these territories are so important. Now, we're not talking about your average sunny holiday spots here. As you can see, these territories are incredibly strategic. New Caledonia holds a quarter of the world's nickel. You need that for electric car batteries. Greenland has rare earth elements. The British Indian Ocean Territory, it hosts a major U.S. military base. The point is, this isn't about nostalgia. It's all about 21st century power and resources. Let's go back to France for a second, because this chart is just stunning. A full 97% of France's gigantic maritime zone comes from its overseas territories. Only 3% comes from France itself, in Europe. Think about that. Without these territories, France instantly goes from a global power to just a regional one. And it turns out these territories are sitting on a literal treasure trove of materials that are critical for the 21st century. We're talking nickel for EVs, rare earths for wind turbines, and high-tech weapons. The paper argues that Europe's entire green transition and even its military independence could actually depend on keeping control over these resources. Okay, so if this is a new kind of empire, how is control maintained without the old-school gunboats and governors? Well, the paper argues that European powers have developed a very sophisticated new colonial toolkit to do exactly that. In the past, the justification was the so-called civilizing mission. Today, the paper argues, that's been replaced by a conservation mission. The new idea is that European control is essential to protect these globally important ecosystems, often from the local populations themselves. And this strategy has a name: fortress conservation. It involves creating these huge, strictly protected environmental zones. But the catch, according to the paper, is that these parks often end up kicking indigenous and local people off the lands and waters they've relied on for generations. And this isn't just some theory. Get this. This quote is from a leaked UK diplomatic cable about creating a marine-protected area around the Chagos Islands, right after the native population had been forcibly removed. The park, the cable suggests, would basically make sure they could never come back. It's using conservation as a geopolitical weapon. The paper also describes a political tool it calls the referendum trap. The argument is that independence votes are carefully set up to fail. First, you change who gets to vote by adding settlers from the mainland. Then, you control the timing of the vote to hurt the independence movement. And finally, you make the territory so economically dependent that voting to leave feels like voting for financial suicide. Now, all of this came to a head in what the paper calls the Greenland case, which it holds up as a perfect example of the whole system's hypocrisy.
So the story starts when the US casually expresses interest in buying Greenland from Denmark. The reaction from Europe was swift. And it was furious, a unanimous cry of outrage against this kind of old-fashioned imperialism.
But here's the double standard the paper just drills down on. The US proposal gets condemned as 19th century imperialism. But at the same time, when France deploys thousands of troops to New Caledonia to secure its nickel mines against indigenous protests, you hear crickets from European capitals. The paper's argument is that the sin wasn't treating territory like an asset, it was just being too honest about it. So why does all this matter on a global scale? Well, the paper connects it directly to the single biggest challenge we all face, the climate crisis. To understand this, we need to quickly talk about blue carbon. This is the incredibly valuable carbon that gets captured and stored in marine ecosystems like mangroves and seagrass beds. In our carbon-obsessed world, controlling these ecosystems is like controlling a bank. And this leads to what the paper calls the trust deficit. Here's how it works. European powers count all that blue carbon from their territories against their own pollution back home. The Global South sees this as just an accounting trick, not real climate action. This completely erodes the trust you need for genuine cooperation. And without that trust, global climate agreements just fall apart. And that leaves us with the paper's final, and I think very challenging question. Can we really build a just and sustainable global future on a foundation that, it argues, is still fundamentally colonial? It's a powerful thought to end on, suggesting that maybe to fix the climate, we first need to reckon with history.